There are airplanes that announce themselves. You hear them before you see them. Big engines, loud confidence, the kind of presence that tells everyone on the ground, this is power. And then there are airplanes that almost vanish into the background, the way a small bird disappears against a gray sky. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper was built to be that second kind of airplane. Quiet, light, harmless-looking, a flying clipboard with wings. It was never meant to be remembered. Yet decades after World War II, in a hangar far from France, people stared at a little fabric-covered aircraft and felt the strange weight of a story clinging to it like smoke that never fully cleared. Under old paint and repaired cloth were the kind of scars a museum doesn't invent. Patchwork that wasn't done for beauty, but for survival. Bullet holes that had been closed up just enough to keep the wings from tearing themselves apart. Evidence that, once upon a time, somebody had taken a plane that should not have mattered and pushed it straight into the category of things the enemy cannot ignore. The plane had carried a name that sounded like a grin. Rosie the Rocketer. A joke at first glance. A dare if you knew what it meant. And the man most tied to that name wasn't a test pilot, wasn't a Hollywood ace, wasn't a fighter jock with a scarf and a perfect smile. He was a history teacher from Illinois, Major Charles, Bazooka Charlie Carpenter. A man who taught battles on chalkboards, then found himself over real ones, watching men burn inside steel and deciding that watching wasn't enough. In September 1944, Lorraine, France, the war had a strange rhythm. Fast advances, then sudden stalls, then brutal counter-punches that left people wondering if momentum was real or just something you felt until the next day proved you wrong. Patton's Third Army was pushing east, but supplies were tight, roads were clogged, and German forces, bloodied but not broken, were looking for places to strike where the American spear could be bent, snapped, or at least slowed long enough to matter. Arracourt was farmland, villages, rolling ground that looked peaceful until fog rolled in and turned it into a stage for armor. Fog is not neutral. Fog is a weapon that doesn't care who deserves it. It hides the attacker, confuses the defender, and makes every decision feel like a guess. And in that fog, German Panther tanks, big cats of steel with long guns, moved like shadows that had weight. They didn't need to rush. They could appear, fire, disappear, and leave a burning wreck behind them as proof that they had been there. The Panthers had range, they had punch, and they carried the psychological advantage that comes from being the thing everybody knows can kill them before they get close enough to answer back. On the American side, Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division was fighting spread out, stretched thin, trying to hold ground and hold together while the battlefield shifted around them. Tank crews were exhausted. Infantry were digging in and moving again and digging in again, and the support units, the ones nobody writes poems about, were still doing the same jobs. Fuel, water, ammo, routes, radios, repairs, all the small lifelines that keep a division alive. When armor appears on the edge of fog, those support units are suddenly not behind the fight anymore. They're inside it, whether they ask to be or not. That's the kind of war Carpenter flew over in a Grasshopper. The L-4 was a liaison, an observation plane, light enough to drop into a field that barely qualified as a strip, slow enough to circle and watch, stable enough to do the unglamorous work of spotting and calling for fire. Its engine was the kind of engine you'd expect on something used to teach teenagers how to fly, not something used to survive rifles and machine guns. The plane's power and speed were modest, its structure vulnerable, its protection essentially non-existent. Yet that vulnerability was part of the trick. It didn't look worth shooting at. It looked like a nuisance. German troops often had bigger problems than wasting ammunition on a tiny cub drifting overhead. And that was fine when Carpenter's job was to see and report. But the longer he flew, the more he learned the sickening feeling of being present but powerless. To circle above a burning tank and be unable to reach down and pull a man out. To watch a crew bail out into a field where machine gun fire stitched the ground. To be the witness who survives, who calls coordinates, who marks a location, who continues flying because that's the job. And then to land and hear the same news again. Another crew lost, another vehicle knocked out, another gap in the line that has to be filled by someone else tomorrow. People imagine courage as an explosion. One loud act, one decisive charge. But sometimes courage is quieter and uglier. Sometimes it is a slow build of disgust and grief, a refusal to keep doing the same safe thing when safe isn't saving anyone. Carpenter was a teacher. Teachers live in systems, lesson plans, curriculum, manuals, rules that tell you what works and what doesn't. War handed him a manual too. Observation planes do not attack. Liaison aircraft are not gunships. Your job is to see, not to strike. But war also handed him something the manual didn't cover. A moral pressure that settled into the body like a weight. When you can see the enemy and you can see your people dying, the distance between "not my mission" and "I can't live with this" can shrink until it becomes a single step. Somewhere along that line, Carpenter started thinking differently. Not like a pilot who wanted glory, but like a man trying to solve a brutal equation. How do you stop tanks when you're flying a plane that isn't supposed to stop anything? The first answer wasn't a miracle. It was improvisation. Bazookas were infantry weapons, portable rocket launchers designed to fight armor at close range. They weren't air-to-ground weapons. They weren't mounted weapons. They were held by soldiers who had to be brave enough to get close. But a bazooka doesn't care who holds it if the rocket goes where it needs to go. And a tank doesn't care what fired the rocket if it hits a vulnerable point. In the field, out of the view of clean doctrine, the idea took shape. Attach bazookas to the Grasshopper's wing struts. Make the plane a platform. Aim by aiming the whole aircraft. Fire with simple triggers. Come in low, fast enough to reduce time exposed to fire, close enough that the rocket's short range doesn't matter. It sounded ridiculous. It sounded like a bad joke. It sounded like something people would talk about in tents and laugh off because the alternative, that someone might really do it, was too uncomfortable. Because if it could be done, then someone should do it, and that meant acknowledging that war had reached a point where fabric planes were being asked to carry the weight of failing plans. Carpenter didn't do it alone. No soldier does anything like this alone. It takes a few people willing to say yes when they could easily say no. A crew chief willing to bolt the launchers in place and wire firing switches. An ordnance specialist willing to hand over hardware and look the other way at the fact that nobody had signed a neat piece of paper approving it. Men who understood that impossible is sometimes just a word people use when they're afraid to try. And then the question becomes, will the wings catch fire when rockets ignite inches away? Will the extra drag and weight make the little plane handle like a brick? Will the pilot be able to pull out of a dive? Will the enemy shoot him out of the ski the first time he tries? You can feel the tension in the concept itself. A grasshopper is fragile. Bazookas add weight and drag, and rockets add more weight, and each added pound is a small vote against survival. Yet Carpenter climbed into the cockpit anyway, not because he believed he was invincible, but because he believed the situation on the ground was more urgent than his own odds. And in the fog around Arracourt, urgency had a sound. The distant clank of tracks, the crack of guns, radios shouting and then going dead, and the low human panic of people realizing that armor is moving toward them, and there may not be time for artillery to save them. The fog that made spotting hard also made ambush possible. American tankers used terrain and surprise to fight, and when the weather favored them, they could punish German advances. But the fog also meant moments of terrifying blindedness. Columns appearing too close, positions overrun, support crews cut off. Carpenter's plane rose into that gray like a moth into smoke. Above the cloud layer, the world was bright. Below it, war was hidden. That is one of the cruelest contrasts in aviation. The sun can be shining up here while men die down there in darkness. Carpenter waited for the fog to break enough to see. When it did, it didn't reveal a clean picture. It revealed fragments, roads, tree lines, fields, a moving stain of vehicles that looked like something the earth itself was pushing forward. German armor, Panthers, the kind of silhouettes that told you exactly what the stakes were. Carpenter had a choice that every storyteller loves to simplify, but every real person knows is complicated. He could radio in positions and let artillery and tanks do the work and hope the timing was right. Or he could do something that would look insane to anyone reading it later. He could point his grasshopper at a tank and attack it with infantry rockets. In a way, the attack begins before the dive. It begins with the moment he decides to commit. Because once you commit, you are no longer an observer. You are a participant. The enemy is no longer something you watch. It is something that can kill you directly and will if it notices you. Carpenter set up with the instincts of a hunter who knows he's the smaller animal. He used light and angle. He came in from positions that reduced the time the enemy had to track him. He went low enough that the ground itself complicated the enemy's ability to aim, because shots fired upward at a moving target are harder than people think when the target is small and the shooter is startled. He wasn't trying to stay safe. He was trying to stay alive long enough to matter. Then the nose drops. Airspeed builds. The little cub stops feeling like a floating leaf and starts feeling like a thrown stone. The wind tears at the struts. The fabric vibrates. The whole aircraft becomes an arrow aimed by muscle and judgment. And below, the Germans do what people always do when something harmless becomes threatening. They hesitate for one heartbeat longer than they should. They look. They point. They try to understand why a liaison plane is coming at them like that. That half second is precious. Then smoke trails bloom under the wings. Rockets that were never meant to be fired from a plane leave the tubes with a violent crack, streak toward the ground, and the world changes. Whether the first hit destroyed a tank, immobilized it, panicked its crew, or forced it to stop and button up, the effect was immediate and psychological. The plane that was supposed to be ignored had just attacked, and once that happens, you can never go back. Carpenter pulled up into the sky with the slow, stubborn climb of an overloaded aircraft. He didn't have the luxury of graceful performance. He had the luxury of being alive. Small arms fire snapped up at him, rifles, machine guns, the kind of fire that usually isn't considered anti-aircraft until you're the pilot and you realize every bullet is an argument. You can imagine the sound inside that cockpit. Fabric popping as a round goes through, metal pinging as something hits a strut or cowling, the sickening thought that there is no armor plate between you and any of it. A fighter pilot in a purpose-built warplane has speed and armor and training designed for this. Carpenter had none of that. He had a teacher's stubbornness and a machine that, by all rights, should have turned into scrap the first time the enemy took it seriously. Yet he came back. That's what makes his story cinematic in the truest sense. Not the first attack, but the return. He went back to reload. He went back to look for more armor. He went back because the people on the ground needed the time he was buying, even if that time came in tiny slices measured in seconds and fear. And the Germans began to learn. At first, they had ignored cubs. That was the old rule. Cubs were not threats. Cubs were eyes. Cubs were buzzing annoyances. After Carpenter, that rule broke. A cub could be a weapon. A cub could be a warning sign. A cub could mean rockets. So the Germans did what competent enemies do. They adapted. They started firing at L4s with everything. They carried dedicated weapons, trained spotters to watch the sky, treated the little plane like a mosquito that might carry poison. That shift alone is evidence of impact. If the enemy changes behavior because of you, then you have altered the battlefield. But Carpenter's legend doesn't survive just because the Germans got nervous. It survives because of one of war's most overlooked truths. Support crews die too, and sometimes they die without anyone ever knowing their names. Somewhere in the chaos around Arracourt, an American waterpoint support crew, men with trucks, hoses, and the ordinary skills that keep an army breathing, found themselves trapped as German armor closed in. No glamour, no heavy weapons, no heroic soundtrack, just the cold fact that a tank doesn't have to be impressed by you to kill you. When Panthers move in, a support crew can be erased in moments, and the division keeps moving and the story never gets told. Except this time, somebody in the sky refused to let it be that simple. Carpenter saw them, saw their danger, and did what he had been doing all day. He took the smallest tool in the war and used it like a knife. This is where you lean into cinematic tension. The trapped Americans looking up, seeing a tiny plane appear low. Too low, hugging terrain, using a tree line for cover. The Germans expecting the obvious, expecting high-angle observation, expecting something they can ignore, or something they can shoot at when it floats. And then the Cub does the opposite. It attacks. It attacks in a way that feels unfair, not because it's powerful, but because it's unexpected. Rockets tear down toward armor. A Panther pauses. Another stops. Maybe one burns, maybe one loses a track, maybe one simply retreats because its commander suddenly realizes he's being hunted by a ridiculous little plane. And that ridicule doesn't matter when it comes with shaped charges. The key is what happens next. The trapped crew moves. They escape while the Germans are forced to deal with a problem they didn't plan for. They survive because someone chose to take a lunatic risk for them. That's the emotional core you want your viewers to feel. Not how many tanks. Not what model bazooka. Not what exact angle. The core is this. A teacher turned an observation plane into a weapon because he refused to let anonymous support soldiers die without a fight. Later, people argued about kill counts because humans love numbers, love scoreboards, love neatness. Some accounts credit Carpenter with 6 tanks destroyed officially, sometimes with a claim that 2 of them were Tigers, because the Tiger name carries mythic weight. But even if the number was smaller, even if some were immobilizations, even if battlefield confirmation was messy, which it always is, the impact was real in the place that matters most. On the ground, in the moment, with living people making it out because a tank column hesitated, broke formation, or retreated under pressure from a threat it didn't understand. That's why Bazooka Charlie caught on as a nickname. Not because it sounds clever, but because it captures the absurdity. Bazookas were for infantry, and Charlie is the everyman name, the ordinary American. An ordinary man doing an extraordinary thing with ordinary hardware and extraordinary nerve. The story spread the way all good war stories spread. Through voices, through laughter that's half disbelief, through men at the edge of exhaustion telling each other, "You're not going to believe what I saw today." A cub with rockets, a grasshopper that bit, a plane that made tankers duck. And that last detail, tankers ducking, matters. Tank crews are trained to fear the big threats, artillery, bombs, anti-tank guns. They are not trained to fear being embarrassed, yet fear and embarrassment often mix. A commander who has been told cubs are harmless now has to accept that harmless is a lie. He must close his hatch sooner, keep his head down, scan for tiny shapes, waste ammunition and attention, add one more layer of anxiety to a job already soaked in it. Carpenter's attacks, repeated, did not just damage vehicles, they damaged the enemy's confidence in the order of things. They created a new rule. If you see a cub, you shoot it. If you see a cub, you assume it might be armed. If you hear that engine note, you prepare to be attacked. That's how legends become tactical realities. Now, in your cinematic telling, you don't need to spend 20 minutes repeating identical attack passes. You turn them into a montage that feels like a heartbeat speeding up. Carpenter lands on a muddy strip, ground crew rushing in, hands on fabric, checking holes, sliding rockets into tubes, wiring and rewiring, wiping oil off the cowling, shouting numbers that aren't glamorous but are urgent. Fuel, time, distance. Carpenter climbs back in, takes off again, disappears into haze, returns again. Each cycle is a gamble, and each cycle teaches the enemy something. The fire grows heavier, the sky becomes less forgiving. The cub comes back anyway. You show the plane as a character that grows more ragged with each return. More patches, more tears, more smoke, more repairs, done with whatever is available because the war does not pause for perfect maintenance. Carpenter's insistence becomes a kind of obsession, but not the selfish obsession of someone chasing fame. The grim obsession of someone who has decided that if the enemy has tanks and your people are dying, then you will be a problem the enemy has to solve, even if it means you might not come home. And that's where you thread in the line that sounds like a slogan but fits the man. Attack, attack, and then attack again. In the cinematic version, you deliver it not as a boast, but as a confession, because that's what it is. An admission that he couldn't stand the role of a spectator anymore. When the battle around Arracourt ground on, the Americans held. Weather shifted. Fog that had helped one side turned and helped the other. The Germans, throwing armor into chaotic fights, lost vehicles and initiative. The Americans, improvising, ambushing and surviving, kept pushing, and Carpenter kept flying. Not once, not twice, but again and again, until his name became part of the division's folklore. He served as an observation pilot for senior commanders as well, because the value of an observer who could also strike was obvious. He wasn't just seeing the battlefield, he was influencing it. The war rewarded him with medals, but medals never capture what makes stories stick. Stories stick because they contain a feeling that viewers recognize. The moment someone decides to do the impossible because the ordinary options have failed, and the story becomes even stranger when you follow Carpenter past the battlefield. Because war didn't end his life the way it ended so many others. Not in a ball of fire, not in the fog, not under the tracks of a panther. After he flew through the kind of danger that should have killed him, he became ill, diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. Cancer, the quiet enemy that doesn't care how brave you are. In the cinematic telling, this is the hardest twist because it feels unfair in a way battlefield deaths sometimes don't. The battlefield death has context. It's expected. It's part of the terrible contract of war. Cancer feels like betrayal after survival. The teacher who dodged bullets and tank guns was now facing something he couldn't outmaneuver. Yet even here, the stubbornness remained. He returned to teaching. He returned to classrooms and students and the strange normalcy of chalk dust and bell schedules. Imagine the weight of that. A man who had watched tanks burn from above, who had decided to become a threat in a fabric plane, now standing in front of teenagers explaining history, while carrying a private history in his bones that no student could fully imagine. He lived longer than grim predictions. He taught. He built a life after war, as if insisting that survival had to mean something beyond mere survival. He died in 1966, not as Bazooka Charlie on a poster, but as Charles Carpenter, a man who had been a soldier, and then again a teacher. And Rosie the rocketer. What happened to the little plane with the scars? Like so many artifacts of war, it drifted, sold, repainted, moved, flown by people who didn't know what it had been, or who knew only fragments. For years, it was just an old airplane, the kind you might see at a small field and never look at twice. Then someone recognized it, identified it, and suddenly the aircraft wasn't just a machine again. It was a witness. Restorers worked on it, and here is where you end cinematically. Not with explosions, but with hands. Human hands, removing old fabric and finding bullet holes. Human hands choosing to preserve the scars rather than erase them, because the scars are the point. Human hands hunting down period-correct hardware, the kind of obsessive detail that feels like reverence, the right engine configuration, the right fittings, the right shape and placement so that when the plane stands in a museum or flies again, it carries the truth of what it was. A small plane with a big story. And the story isn't that Carpenter invented a perfect weapon. The story is that he refused to accept helplessness. He found a way to add pressure where pressure was needed. He forced the enemy to react. He bought time. He saved people most viewers will never know by name. And if you want your audience to feel the cinematic punch, you bring it back to the first idea. Some airplanes announce themselves. Rosie never did. She was too small, too light, too quiet. That's why the Germans ignored her, until they didn't. That's why her story feels like a myth. Until you remember the bullet holes were real. That's why a history teacher mounting bazookas to a fabric plane feels like exaggeration. Until you remember wars full of improvised answers to impossible questions. And maybe that's the real lesson Carpenter ended up teaching, not on a chalkboard, but in the fog over France. Sometimes the manual is written for the world you wish you had, not the world you're actually stuck in. When the world turns into fog and steel, and the people below you are running out of time, you don't always get to choose the perfect tool. Sometimes you choose the tool you have. You bolt on what you need, and you fly straight into the argument. If this story hit you the way it hits me every time I picture that tiny cub diving toward a panther, do two things. Hit the like button so this story doesn't get buried under louder videos, and subscribe for more WWII. Chapters that aren't always in the big documentaries. The weird ones, the improvised ones, the controversial ones that make you argue in the comments because history is rarely neat. And I want you to argue about one thing, because it's the kind of debate that keeps stories alive. What matters more, the confirmed count-on's paper or the moment on the ground when a trapped crew realizes they're going to live because someone in the sky refused to just watch? Tell me where you land. And tell me where you're watching from, because this community spans the whole world, and the whole point of telling stories like this is simple. The people who lived them shouldn't disappear into silence.